The Chinese want, good relationships. They want the UK government to stop sniping at China over certain things when it comes to Hong Kong, Jimmy Lai and Xinjiang. And they also want to have a good relationship because they know there's a chance of things being much more troublesome when it comes to the transatlantic relationship. So there's a strategic game there for Beijing as well.
Keir Starmer is off to China later today for the first prime ministerial visit to the country in 8 years. The last person to go was Theresa May, but he's got a cabinet meeting first, and he might be very glad to leave domestic politics behind him. More on that in just a moment. Robin, what will Keir Starmer himself want out of this visit?
Well, look, I think this trip in itself is a demonstration of success. The fact he's going shows that the relationship between Beijing and between the UK has changed. It was in, the freezer for years under Liz Truss, Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak. The Labour government wants and needs that to change. And the fact that Xi Jinping is willing to host him in Beijing, I think, is enough of a demonstration of success. I mean, we read in the Financial Times yesterday about maybe some agreements on the blocking of the provision of Chinese-made engines for small boats for illegal immigration coming across the channel. That tells you that it's low-hanging fruit here, very low-hanging fruit when it comes to the retail political kind of gains that the Prime Minister wants to secure. But I think this is just all about showing that the relationship is back on a much firmer, much friendlier footing. Clearly, the agreement to let the Chinese shift their embassy to the Royal Mint on the edge of the city is a key part of that. Hopefully the Brits will get the reciprocal agreement in Beijing for their new embassy. It's not in a good condition. There are other things that the UK is looking for. More than anything, it wants British companies to be able to sell more in China as China tries to shift its economy to being one much more focused on domestic consumption. But that's a long-term burn. The Chinese want, good relationships. They want the UK government to stop sniping at China over certain things when it comes to Hong Kong, Jimmy Lai and Xinjiang. And they also want to have a good relationship because they know there's a chance of things being much more troublesome when it comes to the transatlantic relationship. So there's a strategic game there for Beijing as well.
Well, on all that kind of stuff, earlier this year when we were having our big debate over whether China was an enemy and should have been called an enemy as the China spy trial collapsed, how much does China notice and mind that sort of thing?
On one level, it doesn't. We're a P5 member. We're a nuclear weapons state. We have a very, close military diplomatic trade relationship with the United States. So we continue to punch above our weight. And so to that extent, China pays attention to sentiment coming from the United Kingdom, and it doesn't like what it sees as, a dishonest shaming of the Chinese state, whether it's true or not. So it is important to that extent. But, in terms of the trade relationship, it's about £100 billion a year. China's, I think, our third biggest trading partner. It's important for us. But, there are relationships with France, with Germany that are more significant in terms of, industrial might. There are relationships in Asia that are far more important. Of course, the most important relationship is with the United States. So, we read about a three-body problem for Keir Starmer this morning, a kind of trap between the European Union, an evolving relationship there, Beijing, a thawing relationship, and the United States, historically very important, but kind of all over the place at the moment. So it is a juggle. But like I said, I think the fact he's going will be enough for him.
Yeah, loving the three-body problem. Very Chinese. Perfect. The Daily Telegraph reports today that China hacked the mobile phones of close aides to Boris Johnson, Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak in Downing Street for several years. Also, we read today that Theresa May had to take precautions when she visited China in 2018, including changing clothes under the duvet so she wouldn't be filmed. Is it reasonable to assume that Keir Starmer both is being scrutinised, his government is being scrutinised in a similar way to how China once hacked the phones of the Johnson, Truss and Sunak regime, and indeed that he will be scrutinised on his trip in this kind of way?
Look, I lived in Shanghai for 7 years and worked on the Chinese mainland. And in terms of operational security, your assumption should always be that nothing is secure. The way you communicate in China is by a kind of omnipotent app called Weixin, WeChat. That doesn't have end-to-end encryption like iPhone messaging or WhatsApp. So you your working assumption was that, nothing is secure. I remember talking to people coming out to China from the UK government, having two phones, having burner phones. The most important thing, of course, was not to discuss any sensitive matters in the first place on your email or on your phones anyway. But then we had Boris Johnson being chided for using his personal phone when he was in office.
The number was on the internet.
He didn't really grasp the concept of, operational security. Whether it's true or not about, the kind of compromat type of gaining of material, that more sounds like the Russians to me historically than it would the Chinese of filming prime ministers getting undressed. My working assumption was always that what you're doing, where you're going, what you're saying, who you're communicating with, potentially is being watched and is being recorded, and that should be your kind of guiding principle in terms of the things you say, the people you see, and the places you go.
Look, finally, before we move on, you mentioned Jimmy Lai, you mentioned Hong Kong. Starmer domestically, morally, there will be pressure on Starmer to bring these sorts of things up when he is in China. Do you think he's likely to? And if he does, will it just sort of be a token thing so he can say it's been done?
Look, we often don't know because there are readouts from either side, but I'm not sure they're always completely accurate. And, the British government will make the point about, we talk about Xinjiang, we talk about human rights abuses, we talk about Hong Kong, we talk about the national security law, we talk about China's failure to abide by its treaty obligations in Hong Kong. Jimmy Lai is a British citizen. But I think China's approach has always been do these things in private. But of course, as you say, that doesn't work well on this side, where we need to not just talk about it, but say we're talking about it, and people need to understand that it's being raised by ministers right up to the top of prime ministerial level. Will it have any effect? I suspect absolutely none. Jimmy Lai has become this iconic person in terms of being at the helm of a subversive movement as the Chinese mainland government sees it. They'll point to the independence of the Hong Kong courts, previously involving British and other judicial figures. But I'm of the view, no matter how much they continue to go on about it, you do kind of get reciprocal, tit for tat kind of moves sometimes. But I don't think, no matter what the Prime Minister says, that Jimmy Lai's fate is going to be at all influenced by that, unfortunately.